Okay, so leading off where I just left off, which is in another video if you're interested, which is the beginning of this wing covering process, a few gotchas that I should have gone back and dealt with. Let's talk about what do I want to talk about? I guess I'll talk about the stitching. So after you get all the fabric down and get it shrunk to 350, the next thing to do is stitch. Nope, actually before that you paint Polybrush. So they say just one coat of Polybrush, and you really want it to go on pretty heavily because the Polybrush needs to penetrate the fabric to get a good seal. I guess I could show you what it looks like when it dries. This is helpful to understand. So as it says in the Polyfiber manual, this stuff's a vinyl coating, and what it makes is like a film that covers the whole wing. So if you can see how this peels off, that is what Polybrush looks like when it goes on. So that's what I guess is sealing your surface and allowing you a flexible coating for the paint coats to go on. This is actually an old Polybrush container. So you brush the Polybrush on, laying it on pretty thick. You can see the runs here. Maybe you can't. Camera's probably too far away. But the fabric should be soaked enough to where it's basically dripping on the inside. And I always coat the top surface first because it's more sensitive to being sealed. I guess water and sunlight hit the top of the surface first. So if it drips through to the bottom and it seals it the wrong way, it's not as big of a deal. So I paint the top, just sort of lay it on thick and then brush it in. And my strategy is I lay it on thick, brush it in, move on to the next panel. And by the time the next panel is done, then you go back and hit it once with a brush and just push all the bubbles out. And they will go out if you just push it once. So if you try and chase it immediately with the brush, then the bubbles will just stay there. So you have to let it dry just a tiny bit, and then you just push the bubbles out. Piece of cake. Polybrush goes on. One thing I didn't mention is that this leading edge, I pre-coated with Polybrush before I put the fabric on, 2 coats. And that is something that the Polyfiber manual says. If you're going to cover anything with fiberglass, I also think aluminum. So most surfaces, just read the Polyfiber manual. It's not that bad. You cover this with Polybrush first, and that allows the wing actually the fabric to actually stick to the surface so it doesn't flap later on. It's not as good as Polytack. It's not as structurally as strong as Polytack, but at least it'll keep it down in the long run. So Polybrush goes on the wing, then stitching goes on. Hopefully the stitching template you made avoided all the internal stuff, because what I didn't account for, I guess Peter, my uncle, didn't account for was not just the spar that you can hit, but there's all these little cross spars on the inside of the wing, and particularly this one. If you put a hole right on top of that, it is a real pain in the butt to get a rib stitch through there. So definitely do a stitching template and check it on all of your ribs before you go. And if you have to move it a ½ inch either direction, it's not the end of the world while the fabric's off. It's pretty hard when the fabric goes on. So stitching template should have been made. You snap blue lines with chalk across where they're going to go. And then I actually discovered, watching Wendy's video, Wendy is our hero. Wendy is the one who taught me how to do the staggering knot on YouTube, and I'll put a link to her video. She actually burns pretty big holes. You can see in her video, the holes that she's using to stitch are pretty big. So, and they're burned. So she goes through with a hot needle and burns them through. She probably uses a soldering iron. This is my tool. Peter made. Where are you, tool? Aha! Nope. Well, I can't find it. But the tool just basically is a needle that I stuck through the middle, or my uncle stuck through the middle of a cork, so you can hold the cork. Got to use stainless steel, because stainless steel doesn't transfer heat as much as aluminum. So it's a stainless steel rod or needle. It's actually just stainless steel welding rod. Stuck through the middle of a cork, and then you just heat the end with a torch and punch little holes that at every point where the rib stitching will go through. And if you can make really tiny holes, it's going to cause you some grief when you stitch, because it's hard to find those tiny holes with the needle. If they're big, the needle just runs right through and you don't have any problems. Watch Wendy's video on how to stitch. I'm not going to try and explain it. She does a great job. One note that I will say is that the last knot, when you tie it off, just do 2 half hitches. Don't try and do Wendy's craziness. I've seen another video of an AMP doing just 2 half hitches at the end, and it calls it good. That is a little tear. It's because I was trying to go fast and I pulled the fabric, or the rib lacing material, this way. And it's happened to me going that way and that way before. So it's very easy to tear this fabric. It's actually not that easy, but if you're not paying attention, it's easy to tear it. I just talked to Polyfiber, Greg at Polyfiber, great guy. He said, that's fine as long as you have 3/8 of an inch of the finish tape extending beyond that hole. And that's enough to cover it. The hole's pretty small. I don't remember how big the hole. I think he said 3/8 of an inch hole, and it has to be 3/8 of an inch of basically finish tape on the outside edge. So not gonna worry about that, don't need to patch it, but wish I didn't do that. So something to be wary of. A few other things to say about stitching. These reinforcement tapes are really difficult because they only sell half-inch tapes, and this is a 1-inch cap strip. So you have to run them next to each other, and it's got to be really careful to cut them straight and cut them exactly the same length, or else they won't line up underneath your tapes. Mind you, this is a minor aesthetic thing that most people won't even care or notice. But if you're really trying to be super awesome about having it look, as Brandon at Kitfox says, it has to be maximum sexiness. So if you're trying to do that, then mine are not that, because they don't all line up perfectly and they are just a little bit rough, but it's not the end of the world. Okay, so this wing's actually ready for its spray coats. I'm trying to think, there might be something I'm waiting for. There isn't. This is ready for spray coats. I was just kind of being a chicken about it. Finish tapes and inspection rings go on at the same time, pretty much. Inspection rings get glued on, finish tapes get polybrushed on. So the way you need to do this is pre-coat everything and be very, very generous about it. I just started painting and I got some pinholes where I didn't put enough material on, but you really want to gob down the polybrush where these finish tapes are going to go, and then you lay the finish tapes on top. And then I ended up throwing an extra coat of polybrush on top of the tapes, which it does say in the Polybrush manual, or Polyfiber manual, to do, and it ends up making sure that you don't get pinholes. So they should look saturated. These ones do, because I've gone back and put an extra coat on. Let's talk about the leading edge. That's such a bear. I had a long conversation with the Polyfiber guys today talking about this, and this is what Brian Bowen did. Thank you, Brian. What a saint. He's just a hero. So this here is an actual piece of fabric that, because underneath this fabric is this hard surface, and anywhere there's a hard surface, you need 2 layers of fabric. Well, if you had covered it like I said in, I don't know if it's this video or another video, you have to basically wrap the fabric from here on the bottom of the wing. When you first cover, you wrap the fabric from here all the way back to the trailing edge. And that gives you, when you put the top on, that gives you 2 layers of fabric. Didn't do that because the manual doesn't say so. So what Brian did, and what I also did, was took an entire sheet of scrap polyfiber and glued it with poly tack all the way down around the edges, made sure it was cut straight, and then I shrunk it 250 with an iron, which in some cases I needed 350, and it was a real mess. It's got had all sorts of weird wrinkles in it. It took a lot of time to get this looking even decent, and it still needs a little bit more work. But wrapped it around, shrunk it, and then polybrushed it on, and it's pretty smooth. It's laid on there pretty nicely. Then because this seam on the back is an exposed poly tack seam, I ended up throwing a tape on top of that, and that makes sure it's not exposed to the wind. And the wind exposure is really why you have finish tapes on seams. It's because you don't want those seams to be exposed to the wind. If a finish tape does peel up a little bit, it's not structural. And none of the finish tapes are actually intended to be structural. They're just sort of an extra icing on the cake to make sure that everything's not exposed from the wing. So that brought me to another question, which is the finish tapes on the end. Well, what do you do here? Do you wrap it all the way over? Do you see this finish tape I just flushed up against here. Do you wrap it all the way over? What do you do? So in reality, this one's just a reinforcement because it needs 2 layers of fabric over anything hard. So this one I just laid on top. This isn't actually going to get any wind exposure because this fabric wraps all the way under here, right? So this one can't peel out, and it's also riveted in place with this angle or piece of aluminum. The same would be true in the front. This is why I would recommend always wrapping these and not just terminating it, because that edge of the original fabric can't take any wind because it's going to be tucked in on the inside of the wingtip. Now, the finish tape that I did, the monster finish tape on the front, this edge can take wind, but it should be okay, as the polyfiber guy said, that it should be fine. Once it gets Polybrush and poly spray on there and then a top coat of paint, it's going to be just a-okay. And that would be the same for like this surface. You know, that can't take any wind because it's just sort of an edge. This one can, but I'm not too worried about it. I guess in theory I could wrap a tape here, but it's not necessary. It would be an aesthetic thing and would give me like a little bit more protection, but it's not necessary at this point. So the fuel tank, the way I did it, STI wing is different than the other ones because it has this big cup in here. I just sort of covered it, shrunk it all the way, and then cut a nice pattern, and then cut all these little tabs out and glued them with poly tack on the inside. And then the actual finish tape sort of just barely runs on the inside of the edge of that and reinforces this whole section, because that's going to see a lot of abuse, particularly with the cap coming on and off. Okay, I think this video has probably gotten too long. If you're watching it, thanks for sticking in there. There's more I have to say about covering, which I guess I'll do in another clip after this, and talk about, you know, what you got to chase with the iron and whatnot. So that video should be up at some point in time if you're interested. Thanks.